Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are jumping into a couple of flavored ales. They're both completely different. The common element between the two, well, there's a couple common elements. One is they are both California-based craft brewers, and two, they are both flavored ales, though completely different ends of the spectrum. So, the first beer we're going to be starting with today is from the Bruery. This is Xata. It is a blonde ale that's been brewed with rice, lactose, cinnamon, and vanilla. This one clocks in at 7.2% ABV, and the brewery is based in Placentia, California. And then number two, we've got Sierra Nevada. This is Life and Limb, and it is an ale that's been brewed with both birch and maple syrup. This one clocks in at 10.2% ABV. Sierra Nevada is based in Chico, California. Though it should be worth noted, this beer could have easily been brewed at either the Chico, California location or their Mills River, North Carolina location just outside of Asheville. I'm assuming since I'm based in Tampa that they brewed this one at their East Coast operation, as it's much closer to get to me than it is to ship from Chico, California. But nonetheless, we've got two big, pretty high ABV, completely different flavored beers, and I'm really excited to jump in. I have never had either of these prior. Both very, very well-known brewers for brewing excellent beers, well-known in the craft scene, and I can't wait to jump in. So we're going to do exactly that. Starting with the Bruery Xata. This is the blonde ale, 7.2% ABV, rice, lactose, cinnamon, and vanilla, and they're out of Placentia, California. Okay, jumping right into our first beer of today's flavored beer review, we've got the Bruery's Xata Blonde Ale, 7.2% ABV, brewed with rice, lactose, cinnamon, and vanilla, based out of Placentia, California. I have had a few beers from the Bruery, and they have all been top-notch. I have never had this one. So before we even jump in, first I'll show you the art here. This is really neat art. It's very much got kind of an Aztec Mayan theme. This is obviously a blonde ale version of the classic chocolat, hot chocolate-based beverage, which is really the genesis for hot cocoa, in the Western world. And it's brewed with these classic spices that were used in the classic multi-thousand-year-old recipes, only in a blonde ale form. So this one I think is quite interesting. And the addition of lactose and also the rice, this could be a very interesting beer indeed. I'm very curious to see how this comes out, and I have very high hopes. So without further ado, let's get this one cracked. I'm going to try to be a little more gentle. I often have bad luck with my cans. I think I opened them too aggressively. All right, that was pretty solid. Let's get this poured straight in. Oh, that's a lovely color. As I'm pouring it, yeah, it's a lovely looking beer. Absolutely lovely. And I think, yep, I can get the whole can in there. That's awesome. Yes, one of my bigger glasses. It holds a little over a pint, which is great for these pint cans. Okay, visually, absolutely beautiful beer. I would say maybe it looks just a little bit darker than your average blonde ale, but it's still very much a light shade. That much is evident. It's maybe a little got a golden orangey hue to it. It also appears to be rather thick. I can see some fine particulates floating in there, and it appears to have a thickness to it. It does have a slight haze. The lactose will do that. That's why hazy New England style IPAs are hazy. It's the added lactose that hazes them up. Some of them don't, and some of them just use non-filtration to let the particulates float in there, be it yeast or hop sediment. But nonetheless, nice looking beer. Formed an okay head. It's going to break down, but let's give it a sniff. Oh, ho, ho. That smells really, really good. Okay. It smells very interesting. It's got a kind of a mix of a very bright, pungent, fresh, ripe fruit aroma mixed with a boatload of cinnamon and the vanilla on the back. That's what comes through in this aroma. It's an interesting combination. It almost puts me in mind of maybe apple cider, like that you would cook at home, your home-based recipe that you do in the winter. Um, I don't know how everybody brews it, but my mom would brew it often. Pretty much every winter she'll make it, and she'll add orange juice to it, which adds a little extra depth to the flavor. And that's what this smells like. It reminds me of what my mom's apple cider recipe smells like cooking on the stove, which is highest compliment. My mom's a fantastic cook. But yeah, God, that smells fantastic. I can't even wait. I'm going to jump in and let's just see what this is about. Mmm. 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 Oh. Oh, that is fantastic beer. Oh, man. God, that's fantastic. That is so good. Man alive, that is so good. Ah, the brewery. Every time. This is all-star flavored beer. This is how to do it. God. Okay. Compose yourself. Let's talk about this in a calm manner. Man, I wish you could taste this though and smell it. It's exactly what I hoped it would be. All right. The cinnamon and that fruitiness comes through so pungently in this beer. It is not shy on aroma or flavor. It is big. The lactose that they added was a very smart move because it helps add this just slight underlying sweetness, which really does help accentuate and bring out the additive ingredients. But I would not call this a sweet beer by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a slight hint of sweetness. It's more suggestion and really used, for my assessment, to accentuate the flavors that they did add into the beer so that it's not getting drowned out by any bitters or the malt overloading it. And it is very strong cinnamon. I don't mean red hots, I mean proper cinnamon. That comes through quite clearly. The vanilla is subtle. It's subtle in aroma and it's subtle in flavor. It's very much underneath. The rice edition, I think, made a really nice kind of add to the mouthfeel and kind of the way that the beer presents itself. It livens it up, it brightens it up, and it kind of crisps it up into what is a pretty big 7.2% ABV. That's certainly quite big for a blonde ale. And with all these big, bold, pungent flavors in it, I think that the balance that they got in here is spot on. It is absolutely spot on. This is so good. Obviously, not, chocolate. So this isn't, there's several, horchata and chocolate-based beer recipes. I've had a few, and they're very, very good. This is the similar spices, but no chocolate inside. It's done in a blonde ale, and they're not even trying to go down that road. Just a completely different spin, a different interpretation, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful beer. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel and try to walk you through how these flavors develop. The body, I'd say, is medium, medium heavy. When it's in your mouth, really, it doesn't feel that big. I would say it feels mostly medium, but once you start to swallow it, you feel just how much weight this beer is. It's much bigger than it lets on, and certainly bigger than the 7.2 ABV would let on. Mouthfeel. Not a classic blonde ale mouthfeel at all. This has viscosity to it. It is got thickness. It just absolutely has thickness to it, which is quite nice. It does cream up as you roll it around your palate, and it's already got a nice viscous backbone to it, so it really helps these flavors just linger and stick around the palate. It's sticky. The flavors just stick all over the palate, and that is just an absolute treat because this is just a fantastic beer. It tastes amazing. I cannot state enough how much I am enjoying this beer. I'm going to jump in again and explain these amazing flavors to you from start to finish. All right, here we go. You first get it in your mouth, you get that slight sweetness, and you get that fruit. And it does actually remind me of a combination of apples and orange, maybe a touch of pear. It's very nice. And there's that slight sweetness, and that helps accentuate it. And then you're just hit with this burst of cinnamon, and it never really disappears from there. It's this beautiful, bright fruitiness paired with cinnamon and just the subtle underlying vanilla to kind of give it a deeper edge. The cinnamon pairs very well with the fruit flavor, almost like a cobbler or an apple crisp or some kind of baked fruit dessert, you know, where you do the crumbles and caramelize and it's got the cinnamon and the butter and the sugar and it all mixes. It puts me in mind of that. It is just delicious. The finish as well, after all that develops, that's pretty much where it goes. So you have this big peak up and then this beautiful, long, smooth, sweeping curve out to the end of the bell curve. And it lingers. The viscosity is there. The flavors are so pungent. This finish on every sip is exceptionally long. This beer could put many IPAs to shame with how long that it is. It is just that lingering, slight sweetness, slight fruitiness, and that cinnamon, just beautiful cinnamon with that slight kiss of vanilla. It is so good. This is dessert beer at its finest. I mean, I absolutely love this. I am going to take my sweet time enjoying every last drop of this beer while I come up my scores. And when we come back, we will move to our second flavored beer today. That's the Sierra Nevada Life and Limb, the ale brewed with both birch and maple syrup. And that one clocks in at 10.2% ABV. Okay, so moving on to beer number 2 of today's flavored ale review, we've got the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company's Life and Limb. This is an ale brewed with birch and maple syrup. Really, it's quite a high ABV on this one, even bigger than the last. It's 10.2%. Sierra Nevada is based out of Chico, California, though this specific beer could have been brewed either at their Chico facility or their Mills River, North Carolina facility. I presume the North Carolina since I'm down in Tampa, Florida. Nonetheless, let's just take a quick peek at the label art here. It actually looks really neat. It's got kind of an ocean and mountain scene with the earth underneath and this giant tree with various little things all over it. I'll try to angle that and avoid the glare, but it looks really cool. I like the art on the label. It looks really neat. Nonetheless, let's get this one cracked here. Trying to be more gentle when I crack these cans, trying to keep them from spewing all over my table as they are wont to do. All right. Ooh, nice. Nice dark ale. I'd say this is roughly the color of a brown ale. So it ought to have a pretty nice, decent malty back, which ought to pair pretty well with some syrups in there. So you get a little malty sweetness anyway, a little bit of richness from the malt ale. But then you have these two distinct different syrups in the beer. Tried to dribble down the can just a bit. I caught it. All right. So, visually. Yep, it really does look roughly the shade of a brown ale. Maybe just a slight bit lighter with a bit more of a reddish amber hue. But overall, it's about that same depth of color. Formed a really nice head here. Really nice and creamy, quite foamy. I can't really tell how the carbonation is creating what effervescence level it may or may not have. I can see it breaking away pretty rapidly up here on the top. So I think this head is going to do okay, but it's going to collapse relatively quickly. But just based on the way that it looks, I do expect it to have at least pretty good cling to the sides in terms of retention. Maybe a small floating pad on the top. But it looks great. Spin that around, let you admire that label art. Yeah, looks great. Let's give this a sniff. Okay. So I can tell you this has not the most pronounced aroma in the world. In fact, that's really being quite kind. It's barely detectable. Even getting right up on the rim of the glass and really giving a deep inhale, I'm finding it very challenging to pick up notes on this beer at all, aroma-wise. Try to give it just a little back and forth agitation, see if that jostles any of it. It's got just the subtlest aroma. It's almost non-existent. It could be due to this head. I'll see if I can create just a little hole there, give a little agitation, see if that picks up any aroma. Not really. There's just kind of this generic beer smell with a slight hint of sweetness. That's about all I can detect. I would say of all the hundreds of beers I've reviewed to date, this is probably the weakest aroma in terms of how pronounced or not pronounced it is. But that actually kind of makes it interesting. I mean, we do taste beer first with our nose, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage. I don't know what to expect here, but that means it's going to be a complete surprise. So my palate's not really anticipating anything in particular. It's just going to be what comes through to me. So I'm going to jump straight in and give it a sip, and we'll see what comes through. Mm. Mm. Okay, that's a nice beer. That's very enjoyable beer. Going in completely with no expectation from getting a tease from an aroma perspective, I'll tell you my initial thoughts, and I really quite enjoy it. What this reminds me of very much is a classic German Doppelbock, and a big one, a high ABV Doppelbock. That's what the malt bill reminds me of most similarly. I don't know how they constructed their malt bill, but I would say almost visually, it's not that far off the mark. And the way that the flavors come across really does pair well with the syrups that they added. And I can tell you, it is subtle. You can pick up the syrups, no question about it, and it tastes nice, and you can get that maple, and the birch syrup, it's got this more slightly interesting, not as pungently sweet kind of side of the flavor. It tends to pair more into the malts while the maple kind of hits on the front and adds a little more dessert side to the beer. Not that it's overtly sweet by any stretch of the imagination, but that's kind of how the two different syrups that are combined into this beer are playing into it flavor-wise, at least on my palate. I'm going to jump back in for another sip here, explore body and mouthfeel, and start to think a little deeper on how these flavors develop. Body is lighter than you'd expect for a 10.2% ABV beer. I would say it's medium to medium heavy. It really doesn't even encroach on heavy territory, so it's much lighter than the ABV would suggest. Which really, the malt bill reminding me so much of a Doppelbock, that's not that off the mark. Even though they are higher ABV beer, body-wise they don't tend to be super duper robust, at least in terms of feel. Mouthfeel, it's definitely got some viscosity to it. I wouldn't say it's super thick, but it's got a thickness. It's thicker than your average beer. It's got a bit of effervescence in it as well. It's got a decent bit of carbonation. So when you start rolling it around the palate, it doesn't cream up too well, which if I'm continually thinking about a Doppelbock as kind of the base, but with maple syrup, and I'm just using that as that's where my brain went based on the flavors that came through to me in the malt profile. It's actually on the mark. They just call it an ale brewed with, you know, syrup of this and syrup of that. So I really don't know what their base beer style is for this. But it really does remind me of a Doppelbock that somebody added some birch and some maple syrup to. And it's quite enjoyable. This is a very tasty beer. I'm going to jump back in one more time to explain to you exactly how these flavors develop and see what else I can pick up that I maybe missed. First, get it in your mouth and it rolls around the palate. First thing you get is this slight malty sweetness, but it's got a richness to it, almost a caramel-like richness to it. Again, akin to a Doppelbock. And then this nice, big, boozy quality that comes through to it. It's not overbearing. It's not off-putting, but it's there. Again, akin to a Doppelbock. Or maybe even an Eisbock, the higher ABV cousin. Maybe somewhere between the two. Bit more boozed edge than your average Doppelbock and a little toned down from your average Eisbock. But somewhere in there. And it's got that similar flavor to the malt bill. It's a richer, deeper, more robust malt. It's got elements of caramel, but it's got elements of toastiness. So it's kind of like, I don't know how many Doppelbocks, how often you drink that style, but I kind of think of them somewhere between, in terms of flavor profile, a brown ale, where you get some of those deeper, maltier, but roasted edge to it, and often a little bit of a nuttiness. And then you've got the flip side where there's the more caramelly, richer, kind of buttery toffee caramel side. It's kind of a hybrid between the two. It sits in the middle. That's roughly where the malt flavor profile. That's why it reminds me so strongly of a Doppelbock. It does taste remarkably like a Doppelbock malt bill. But then you get this underlying birch and maple that comes through quite clearly. The birch really does, for me personally, pair quite well with the malt bill. It accentuates it and adds another layer of depth. The maple, on the other hand, is what kind of cuts through all of the malt and the birch that marries with it and like comes out with its own voice, kind of writing in the back. And it adds like the suggestion of sweetness without being sweet, really. There's a slight hint of sweetness to it, but I don't think they added lactose or anything. It's just where your brain goes by tasting these flavors. And the maple kind of rides in that category. It throws like the extra added element that's completely different from what else is going into this beer. It's very nice. It's very enjoyable. It's rich. It's nutty. It's got this nice roasty character to it, as well as this depth of caramel and kind of toffee and buttery character to it. And it's got this slight earthiness to it. I don't know if that's coming from maybe the birch side of the maple syrup, just the way it's pairing with the malt bill. It's definitely not coming from the maple. I can taste that quite clearly. But there's a definite slight earthiness to it that's kind of riding on the back edge of the roasty malt character. It's very, very enjoyable. It's a very nice beer. Not as big and robust in terms of body and mouthfeel as I anticipated, but the flavor, it's an absolute treat. This is a really, really good beer. This beer is all about what they added to it, and it's all about the malt bill. It does have a slight bitterness to it. There's a natural bit of bitterness. I'm sure that they added some classic kind of bittering hops in there, but not in high amounts. It's not supposed to be overtly bitter, but it's enough in there. It's a very well-rounded beer. It's got a lot of breadth, and the depths and layers of flavors are very interesting. So that just keeps marrying with each sip, and the finish is actually pretty long. It's not long in the same sense of like big, high alpha acid content IPAs stick around with all the lingering bitters, but what you keep continuing to taste is kind of the subtle remnants of the syrups that are in there and a little bit of the mixture of the malt bill. So I can still taste the roasty malt, I can still taste the caramelly side of the malt and the buttery side of the malt, that slight earthiness to which I alluded, and then both of the independent different syrups that kind of added to the equation. You can still taste the residuals on there with the very end of the finish. And it's not dry, it's very thick, very wet, and it's very enjoyable. This is an exceptionally well put together beer. It's got a lot going for it. There's a lot of depth to it and layers. It's very multifaceted, but this is one for a malt lover. That's my opinion. I think people that even like bitter beers would probably enjoy this as well if you're into big, flavorful, complex beers. It's almost encroaching slightly into the barley wine territory in terms of depths of how interesting and different flavors come and interplay. It's got a lot going for it. It's a very complicated beer and it's very enjoyable. I'm going to take my time sip on this. This one's going to take me a while. It's a very big, complex beer. Come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers rated from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, let's go through and get them ranked. Starting with the Brewery's Xata, this is the flavored blonde ale, 7.2% ABV, brewed with rice, lactose, cinnamon, and vanilla. The brewery is based out of Placentia, California. Starting with the aroma on this one, it was very, very aromatic. It had quite a pungent aroma. You could smell it from a very good distance away, and it smelled amazing. Before you even got this beer in your mouth, you had a pretty good sense of what you were about to get into. And based on the kind of blonde ale tweak on the classic chocolat seasoned recipe, horchata kind of stuff in that vein, I think they nailed it. This was absolutely delicious. Pungent aroma that really belied what you're about to get into. I gave it a 9 out of 10. Related to that, the taste was absolutely incredible. I mean, the cinnamon was big and bold and pungent. It had just the right amount of sweetness, the vanilla undertone, and it all paired so beautifully with the blonde ale malt bill. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Body-wise, for 7.2% ABV, certainly this had some substance, even bigger than I thought for the ABV. Very atypical for a blonde ale, to be certain. but they don't normally have ABVs that high anyway, and this beer had substance, and it really worked with the flavors that were in this beer. I loved it. 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this one. Again, the mouthfeel was a little atypical for a blonde ale. This one, the beer was naturally so heavy and thick that it did have a good bit of viscosity, so that side of the mouthfeel felt really nice in tandem with the weight of the beer itself. But kind of going with that added thickness and the lactose in there, I expected that it would get a bit creamier than it actually did. I gave it overall certainly above average, but I did dock some points just based on expectations. Gets an 8 out of 10. Finish on this beer was very, very long. As pungent as the aroma was and the flavors were, I got to be honest, I did not expect the finish to last as long as it did on each sip. It just kept going. The flavors just kept intensifying, and then when they finally got there, it was a long, even descent to the end of having any remaining and residual flavors on the palate. I mean, honestly, this beer would put to shame many, many, many high alpha acid IPAs in terms of length of finish. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Head and retention did pretty good overall. It formed pretty well, retained okay. It was certainly above average. Not really as well as I was expecting considering the rice added lactose and the thickness of it, but it still did above average. I gave it a 7. Appearance-wise, a little bit darker than your average blonde ale, but certainly well within the range of the higher ABV. I teeter-tottered on this one. I did dock 1 point. I gave it a 9. Balance. Absolutely amazingly balanced beer. Honestly, I think that the ingredients that they put into this and the ratios that they use, they absolutely nailed it. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I loved it. I thought the beer was completely delicious, and frankly, I thought it was quite unique. I've had a lot of beers of this kind of type playing with this recipe, but I've never had one that was done quite with that additive bill or in a blonde ale format, and honestly, it completely worked for me. I was blown away. I loved it. I give it a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of this style, this is another one that I was kind of on the fence because it's a little hard to pin down. It's a much bigger, bolder blonde ale with some adjuncts added, and I did dock some points in some key categories, but overall, honestly, I think this beer really, really is a well-done example of what it is they're trying to do. So I did go with a perfect 10 out of 10 because, frankly, the categories where it did lose points weren't that key to kind of getting the gist of what this beer was about. Just a few little minor nitpicks. So I did give it the full 10 as an example of the style. And that's going to bring the total score on the Brewery's Xata to a 93 out of 100. So very, very high score, certainly well above average. It's honestly one of the beers I've enjoyed the best I've had this year. I was very, very pleasantly surprised. And anybody that kind of likes those flavors or has never tried this one, I would certainly add this to my list to see if you can get your hands on it. I thought it was fantastic. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Sierra Nevada's Life and Limb ale brewed with both birch and maple syrup. 10.2% ABV on this one, so quite a bit higher ABV than on the prior. Based out of Chico, California. Could have been brewed at Chico or Mills River, North Carolina. Starting with the aroma on this one. Honestly, I don't remember the last time I had a craft beer where I thought the aroma was weaker. I mean, it was so weak you could say it was almost indetectable. It didn't matter how deeply I breathed, how close, back and forth, agitating, moving the foam, agitating the beer itself. I just could almost get absolutely nothing out of it. It gets 1 out of 10. Moving on to the taste. The taste was really quite nice. This was a very big, very complex beer. I kept making kind of comparisons to a cross between, say, a Doppelbock and an Eisbock malt bill, then with this added syrup character, and I stand by that. I have no clue what their base malt bill is, but if they were using something between a Doppelbock and an Eisbock, it really works in this beer. And frankly, if that is the base style kind of malt characteristic they were going for, they did a heck of a job with it because it was really, really well done for either of those styles. I mean, that's a first sip in my mouth immediately where my brain went, and it kept going there on subsequent sips. I really thought it was quite nice. I give it an 8 out of 10. Body on this one. Much like the aroma, this is another category I was a bit mystified by. 10.2% ABV. I really did expect this beer to have some weight to it, especially considering added syrups, but honestly, it was just meh. It was just average, and it gets an average score. It gets a 5 out of 10. Mouthfeel, a little bit better than the body, though not by much. You know, I did expect it to get a bit creamier. I did expect it to have some viscosity sense to it. It had a little more thickness than the actual breadth and weight of the beer, but not by much. Again, it's average, but I gave it high end. I gave it a 6. Finish on this beer. Finish on this beer was very nice and very long. Just like on the Breweries or Xata, the finish on each sip of this just kept going and going and going. And similar, I mean, completely different beer drinking experiences, but aspects of the actual drinking experience very, very similar. With each sip, you got to keep exploring more and more flavors that just kept rolling in and out of each other and pairing and mixing and just going and going and going. That for me is just a home run of a finish on a beer. 10 out of 10, no question about it. Head retention, this one did quite well. It bloomed pretty well and it held pretty well. It collapsed just a little bit quicker than I anticipated. And again, I think it was probably from carbonation, but it was hard to tell in the glass. You know, expecting it kind of had similar character traits to a Doppelbock or Eisbock. Yeah, there could be some carbonation there, but overall, I thought it was pretty close to perfect. I only docked 1 point. I give it a 9. Appearance-wise, this was a category that was kind of hard for me to judge, as it just says ale with the added syrup, so I have no clue what the base is supposed to be, but frankly, an ale that looked nice and had some added dark colored syrups. I thought it looked great. I couldn't dock points. I gave it a 10. Balance on this. Again, I thought this was another exceptionally well-balanced beer. Really, the key on this one was letting the malt bill shine, and then the syrups were just like this added subtlety bonus that kind of got to interweave in and out of the malt bill in various ways. And frankly, it was very enjoyable, and the subtlety of it, I think, is what really sealed the deal for the balance for me. Nothing about it was in your face, and the way that they interplayed, it was just really, really enjoyable on each sip. I thought they nailed it. I give it a 10 out of 10. For the feeling and the intangible, I absolutely love this beer. I really, really did. I thought that the malt bill that they put together and the way that the syrups worked with them, I thought it was a home run. I give it a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, it's hard for me on this one because I don't really know what the base style is supposed to be. So, you know, I'm just kind of generically thinking in my head, here's the malt bill, and it's a flavored, you know, brewed with this version and that. It did lose quite a few points on a few pretty key categories, which really were related to important aspects of the beer, especially for that ABV, body mouthfeel, and aroma in particular. Even though I really, really enjoyed this beer, and I thought it was very, very well done, it had a lot of interesting subtlety, the points that it did miss were pretty big, so I did have to dock some as an example. I give it a 7 out of 10. That brings the total score on Sierra Nevada's Life and Limb to a 76 out of 100. So we're looking at a pretty large point spread here, all totaled 17 points difference between the two. But they were both completely different and unique beers in their own right, and I did really enjoy them both, despite the scores. This one, I mean, it just nailed almost every category down the board. This one had a few misses for me on specific categories, but as a overall package for the beer experience, I do think this is one to seek out. I think they both are. If you're into flavored beers, interesting kind of things that brewers come up with, I think these should both be on your radar. Nonetheless, folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, folks, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.